Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for a Zoom discussion of Portnoy's complaint. And I anticipate a very lively discussion on this book today. I'm Nadine, the Philip Roth Personal Library Librarian at the Newark Public Library, and I look forward to learning more about this work. So please feel free to type any questions or comments into the Q&A or into the chat as they come to you, and we'll address them after we hear from our host. Though we've been keeping the format of the book club meeting as a webinar for security reasons, I will take questions in the order that they come in, and then I will call on you and unmute you. So what we'll do today is I will unmute you, and please introduce yourself and tell us where in the world you are at the moment. Depending on the time, we might not get to all of your questions. So at 2 o'clock, we do start wrapping up. Please note that if you're using the chat, send the message to everyone, not just the hosts and panelists, so that everybody can see your question. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available on the Philip Roth Personal Library YouTube page afterwards. Our host today is Stephen Sampson, Paris-based literary critic and novelist who writes in French. Sampson is the author of 2 book-length essays, Corpus Rothi and Corpus Rothi II, as well as a novel, Moi, Philip Roth. So I'd like to introduce you to Stephen Sampson, and maybe you could tell us how you got into Philip Roth.
Well, thanks for that nice introduction, Nadine, and thanks for inviting me to host this book club. I'm honored and excited about it. I got to Roth through Yiddish, actually. I grew up in Milwaukee. I'm an American, though I write now in French, and I had this love for the Yiddish language. I think if I could have done something, I would have written in Yiddish. And so I did a master's degree in Paris about a Yiddish writer, Shalom Aleichem, and an American Jewish writer, Henry Roth. And I wanted to keep in the Yiddish field, but I didn't have the right level. So I started working on Philip Roth, Saul Bellow and Roth, and then just Roth. And I did a PhD on Roth. And the original idea was sort of looking for traces of Yiddish in Roth. And which is partly why perhaps Portnoy's Complaint is one of my 2 or 3 favorite books by Roth, because it's the book, I would say, where you find the most traces of Yiddish in the novel. In fact, in some ways, you could say one of the goals of the novel would be to sort of transmit the flavor of Yiddish to a general American public. So that's how I got to Roth, and then I did these 2 essays, and then I wrote my novel about a Jewish American doctoral student in Paris who thinks he is Philip Roth. So that's how I got to Roth. As I understand it, this is the eighth one of these book clubs. And when I was asked which novel I wanted to talk about, I said Portnoy's Complaint, thinking it had probably already been taken, let's say in the first or second, meetings. And to my great surprise, no, it hadn't been gobbled up yet, which I'm sort of surprised, because in my mind, it's really the classic book by Roth, the most important one. That's a debatable point of view, and probably the most fun one, but so lucky me, it's still available. It was Roth's 4th book, his first novel that came out in 59 or 60 called Goodbye Columbus, which was a collection of short stories, won the National Book Award. And this was the first. Goodbye Columbus, Roth was very criticized because people, particularly by the Jewish community, they said he was sort of airing dirty laundry. He was sort of sharing the secrets, Jewish secrets, with the general public, and making the Jewish community not look that good. So there was the family that was sort of materialistic, or that was concerned that the son wasn't making enough money. There was a Jewish man who was cheating on his wife. There was a couple of Jewish soldiers who were trying to use their religion as an excuse to get out of some of their duties in an army base, and then actually to get out of getting sent to Japan, et cetera, et cetera. So that book came out. Then Roth did a book, a long novel called Letting Go, which I think was his attempt to be Henry Roth, whom was one of his idols. Then he did a 3rd novel, which is very underrated, called When She Was Good, which in my mind is sort of a book where he's trying to get in the head of non-Jews and write sort of a totally non-Jewish novel, a Goyish novel, if you will, which I think is an excellent novel, but was not that well received. And then finally in 1969, Portnoy's Complaint came out, and this is the book that made him famous. It was an explosion. There was a famous incident on the Johnny Carson show where Jacqueline Suzanne, who had written this trashy novel at the time called Naked Came the Stranger. No, that was another one. Hers was The Love Machine, I think. And she was asked, would you like to meet Philip Roth? And she said, well, I would, but I wouldn't shake his hand. And the joke was because, of course, for a lot of people, this was the book that first openly talked about masturbation. So, and again, it was in the minds of some people, making Jewish people not look that great. But I think by this time, this was 10 years after Goodbye Columbus, and some of this, Roth was starting to get accepted into the mainstream of American letters, and even get accepted in the mainstream by the American Jewish community. So Roth knew he was going to become famous with this book. He even said to his parents, "You be careful because it's going to be a big reaction." They thought he was being a megalomaniac. So I think what this book is, what Portnoy's Complaint is doing, is it's sort of vulgarizing it, vulgarizing in the good sense of the word, the sense meaning making something available to a larger public. He's vulgarizing two or three things. One thing is psychoanalysis, because the whole book is presented as a long psychoanalytical session where the author, the first person narrator, Portnoy, Alexander Portnoy, is addressing his doctor in the first person. But of course, you, the reader, you're sort of attending this and looking at this as though you were sitting in the room watching the psychoanalytical session go on. And the name of the book is actually a hypothetical, it's supposedly an entry from a psychoanalytical dictionary about this psychoanalytical disorder called Portnoy's Complaint, which would have been named after the patient Portnoy. And I'm not going to get too much into the biographical stuff because that's not my approach. We've got Ira Nidell sitting in, who wrote an excellent biography of Roth. But that said, there are important biographical information to know, namely that Roth had sort of an unhappy experience with psychoanalysis. I believe it went on for 2 years. I think the name of the shrink was Kleinschmidt or something like that. Ira can correct me. And it also happened to be the same shrink who much later Adam Gopnik, the correspondent for the New Yorker, had as a doctor. And Adam Gopnik wrote some very interesting pages about this shrink, explaining how he was particularly interested in working with artists. And he had this theory about artists and neurosis. And Roth actually got into sort of a public exchange of angry correspondence with this shrink after this unsuccessful psychoanalysis. So while there are some people who consider Roth sort of very interested in psychoanalysis, and which is not false, I would say that in some ways this is a parody of psychoanalysis, which is not giving it's sort of showing what it's about, but making fun of it at the same time. And of course, at the very end of the book, he said, "So," said the doctor, "now we may perhaps to begin." Yes, which suggests that the entire book is not even part of the session. It's the sort of the preliminaries before we get to the session. Another thing that we should say about Portnoy's Complaint is that it's sort of introducing to a general public the whole idea of male adolescent sexuality in a very frank way, talking about masturbation, which I believe no other novel had done at that point in American literature. So it shocked people, but it also, I think, titillated them, which is why the book sold so well. And people may be noticing that I'm using the word Jewish a lot. I'm talking about Jewish American literature, Jewish this, Jewish that, which is problematic, and I would admit that myself. But I'm doing it deliberately because I think it was an issue for Roth. His two great precursors in as Jewish American novelists were Bernard Malamud and Saul Bellow, and Roth wrote very well about them in a collection of essays that came out in '76, I believe, called "Reading Myself and Others." And he had a chapter on Malamud, he had a chapter on Bellow, and he explained that he felt Bellow was writing his sort of most open, most expansive works, his most interesting books, including Henderson the Rain King and The Adventures of Augie March, when he wasn't clearly identifying his narrator as Jewish, when it wasn't clearly a Jewish person. And when Bellow was writing about Jewish people, then the literature was sort of claustrophobic and very tense. And so Roth nevertheless was a great admirer of The Adventures of Augie March by Bellow, which came out in '49. And so he, in Portnoy's Complaint, I think, was trying to say, well, but again, his criticism of The Adventures of Augie March, his analysis of it was that it wasn't a clearly identified Jewish book. So he's trying to appropriate the voice of Bello in The Adventures of Augie March and say, okay, well, Jewish people can do this too. Jewish people, we can write in a clearly Jewish voice, exuberant, and not be afraid of showing ourselves as not very pleasant or not very nice on occasion, and in a Jewish voice. And so again, he's using a lot of Yiddish words, which Bello had not done in the so-called general public novels. And I think one of the key phrases in this book, which I assume most of you have read, is put the id back in the yid, which is an hilarious sentence because Freud talked about three sort of mental, I don't know how you put it, but three levels of consciousness: the id, the ego, the id, and the superego. Meaning the id is sort of this basic drive, this basic sort of amoral impulses. The ego is the I, and the superego is this sort of the conscious that prevents people from maybe doing everything they want to do. It's the conscience that inhibits us. And so he's saying, we Jewish people, we've been too inhibited all this time. I'm going to put the id, this sort of primitive drive. I'm not afraid of anti-Semitism. We've moved beyond that. I'm not worried about what anti-Semites will say about us. I'm going to show this exuberant, proud, angry Jewish person who wants to sleep with non-Jewish women, and the hell with it. And people can think what they want. And pardon my English, but there are a lot of swear words in this book as well. A lot of the Yiddish words that are used for them are sort of vulgar words. I made a brief list of them, including Rachmonis, Nash, Schmutzig, Matzerbrei, Stupping, Schickses, Tischkes, Schmegegi, Hutz, Oi, when they're liegt in der Schechel in der Erd, and a lot of these words have to do with the male sexual organ. So there was a very famous article that came out in Commentary shortly after Portnoy's complaint came out by Irving Howe, who was sort of considered the great man of Jewish literature at any rate. He'd written a book called The Word of Our Fathers, in which he criticized Portnoy's complaint, and he said that it wasn't really a novel; it was just sort of a collection of scenes. And he also said that this man, Philip Roth, had very thin level of Jewish culture. To some extent, I would agree with the criticism that Roth did not have that much Jewish culture. Personally, I don't think that's a problem with the novel. I think it was for Howe because he was coming from a different generation and a different time. That said, when I reread this book for our book club for the 10th time, I was very interested in the structure because I thought, what about Howe's point that this book lacks structure? It's just a collection of scenes. And so I sort of noted how the book was structured. And what I noticed was in this copy that I have, which is a paperback from Vintage, Portnoy's Complaint, pages 0 to 123 are really the story of his childhood in Newark, where he's sort of exaggerating things in a very exaggerated Freudian way. So he talks about how his mother, he talks about his love for his mother. She was so deeply embedded in my consciousness. For the first year of school, I seemed to believe that each of my teachers was my mother in disguise. You almost feel like he's writing that for Freud. So there's a lot of anecdotes about his childhood in Newark, about baseball, about some of these unsuccessful sexual scenes with girls, again, non-Jewish, when he and his Jewish friends are still adolescents, young adolescents. And then this goes to 0 to page 123. And then on page 123 of my edition, which would be about halfway through the book, he introduces the monkey, as he calls her, which is because that's her nickname, who to some extent I think is based on Roth's first wife in real life, Margaret Martinson Williams, who he married in 1959. And the monkey is going to sort of help this Jewish guy get out of his excessively inhibited conscious state and go out with a sort of a loose, sexually liberated Goyish, meaning non-Jewish woman, because that's his fantasy of what non-Jewish women are. And so the monkey is pages 123 to 131, again 140 to 150, and then 169 to 177. So there's three sort of sections about the monkey, and they're interspaced with three sections where Alexander Portnoy is also talking about being a slightly older adolescent and his fantasies about Goyish women, meaning non-Jewish women, ice skating back in Irvington Park in Newark. So you could say that this second part of the book is about sexuality, but mostly the Jewish guy fantasizing or then acting out his sexual life with a non-Jewish woman. And then towards the end of the second section, there's a chapter about Kay Campbell, who's his college girlfriend, and he goes out to Iowa to meet her family. And this, again, one might say, I don't remember if it was Roth who said this about himself, or a literary critic said that the Rothian character is not making love to a woman, he's making love to America itself. And you can sense that this quest for the non-Jewish woman is really a quest for America. And then at the very last part of the book, he gets to Israel, and there's 20 or 30 pages about Israel, again, viewed through women. So there's two sort of comic failed sexual encounters, one with a soldier and one with a kibbutznik. And one could almost argue that these are sort of Israeli versions of the Goyish woman, meaning she's not obviously the Roth's image of the Goyish woman, meaning not neurotic and not inhibited, and sort of more physical and less maybe mental. If this all sounds sort of sort of a caricature, we can talk about that. But I think there is some level of caricature in Roth. And I'll say just one or two last things, and I'll open up to you. One is that what's interesting, a lot of people talk in general about writers that they have so many different books, 20 or 30 different books. Each time it's different. My own theme about Roth, and this is not a criticism, I would say this about most great writers, is that in some ways they're always writing the same book. And so I think one of the things that's interesting about Portnoy is that it's a precursor for a lot of stuff that we'll see in later books. For example, Margaret, the relationship with his wife, is treated in a much more explicit way in My Life as a Man, even if it's still fictional. And the Israeli chapter is reminiscent of stuff that happens in Operation Shylock and in the Counterlife. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing, I think I may have forgotten. Oh yeah, the other thing that's important to say is that I think having become famous, I think Portnoy's complaint and the fame that it brought Roth was so traumatic that the trilogy he wrote in the 70s and 80s, the Newark trilogy, the first one, which was The Ghostwriter, Zuckerman Unbound, and The Anatomy Lesson, was a reaction to Portnoy's complaint, in which he creates his alter ego, Nathan Zuckerman. And Nathan Zuckerman supposedly wrote a bestseller called Karnofsky about a character named Gil Karnofsky, which resembles Portnoy's complaint. And it's a comic take at how all these readers were so stupid, they confused Nathan Zuckerman, the author of Karnofsky, with Gil Karnofsky, suggesting that everyone's so stupid to have thought that Philip Roth is Alexander Portnoy. But it's sort of a Russian doll. It's taking place on many levels. But that shows how central Portnoy's complaint is in Roth's career. The fact that it's the book then that created, in some ways, the Newark trilogy of the 70s, which is a reaction to it. So I hope that was somewhat interesting, all that. And now I'll open it up to you.
Thank you. We received 3 questions by email from Lawrence Stern. So Lawrence, if you remember your questions, I also have them written down. I'll let you speak. Just introduce yourself and tell us where you are right now. So Lawrence, you can unmute yourself.
Oh, there. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm in New York City, and I can't remember how well I wrote the questions, so you can read them, and that would be good.
Sure. One of them was, what is the purpose of the use of italics throughout the book?
I'll take this question now.
Yes.
Very good question. There's off the bat, I would say there's 3 or 4 different uses of them. One is the Yiddish. So generally speaking, the Yiddish words are in italics. A second thing is, I think this is a very musical book, one of the 2 or 3 most musical books that Roth read. To me, it's a long poem, and you can read it aloud, and it's just beautiful, or it's comic, or it's beautiful. I just opened this up randomly, and I have in front of me a paragraph that begins, "But babble, babble all you want, Dad, dear. A question has just occurred to me 25 years later." This is just poetry. It's a rhythm. That's how he's writing. And I think he integrates the Yiddish into that, but he puts the Yiddish in italics. Here's another excerpt from the previous page. "With those legs, why, of course, he was stuffing her." and stopping is in italics, and stopping means having sex. So that's one of the things is the Yiddish, but not just that. Oh, here again with the Yiddish, a little Rachmonis, because I'm sick and tired of Goyish of this and Goyish of that. If it's bad, it's the Goyim. All those Yiddish words are in italics, but a lot of times it's not Yiddish words in italics. And I think there he's trying to emphasize the music. It's the, I like the iambic pentameter. He's trying to show you where you should put the accent. So wait, the girl will be finished in a few minutes. And now in italics, but I will not treat any human being outside of my family, not in italics, as inferior. Now, I think sometimes the italics, it's for the shrink. So these are the words he wants the shrink to pick up on, or he's insisting for the shrink and or for the reader, because in a way we're in the position of the shrink, we're the same person. But it's sort of to help you with the music, almost as, with the Torah, in the Torah, there's what's called the cannellations, the little signs that are put up above each syllable or each letter, each syllable in the Torah, which tell the reader of the Torah how to read, what sort of music, what sort of emphasis to put on that syllable. Similarly, I think Roth is sort of trying to give us, or Portnoy, if you will, is trying to give us guidance as to where to put the emphasis, where to put the accent. And a lot of times the italic lines are actually the funniest ones.
Lawrence's second question is, for Jewish men who grew up in the 50s, the book is a hilarious confirmation that their neuroses were shared. What did it mean for non-Jews?
First of all, I grew up in the 60s and I'm Jewish, so it's a good question. You'd have to ask that to a non-Jew. What is the non-Jewish reading? First of all, is there a Jewish reading number one and then a non-Jewish reading number two? I'm not sure. I mean, that gets into this whole question of appropriation, which has become more current nowadays. I think it's less relevant now than it was in the 50s. I think probably when Portnoy came out, a lot of people it was probably sort of an introduction to American Jewishness for a lot of non-Jewish American readers at the time. For that matter, I'm not sure. I think it's a book that's hard to translate into other languages because the interplay with the Yiddish and the American English is very interesting. I've read it in French translation. I think it works much less well in French. But the other thing to say about America is that Yiddish probably penetrated more into America, had already penetrated somewhat more into American English than it had in other languages. And certainly thanks to Roth and his followers, it's even more so penetrated. There are Yiddish words that are known to non-Yiddish speakers, to American speakers in New York and elsewhere in America that are not known in other languages. I'm thinking of tchotchkes, for example, or even nash, or words don't come to mind right away, but there's words that Americans will know that are Yiddish words and French people will not know them. So it's so I think that the American reaction, the American non-Jewish reaction, is also probably somewhat different than it would be in other countries. I think Jewish writers and artists had a more important influence on American culture than they did in other countries.
And the last question from Lawrence was, Roth reportedly had a warm, loving relationship with his parents. Where did he get the true-to-life 50s dynamics that resonate with us Jews who grew up then?
First of all, well, first let me ask a question of Lawrence, if that's all right. What do you, because you know the 50s better than I do. What do you see as some of the true-to-life 50 dynamics in that?
The oppression of the parents on the child, the strictness of the Jewish restrictions and on behavior, the fantasy about shiksas, all of that.
Right.
All of that. When I read the book, it's as if I wrote it. It was if he mirrored what was in my head in those days, almost incident by incident. He had to be home 5:30 for dinner. I had to be home 5:30 for dinner when my father came home. His mother took him aside and said, oh, boy, I could have married so and so, who is now a rich man. My mother did the same. It's incredible how he spoke what was in my head at the time. So, but uh, my understanding is that when Portnoy's complaint came out, his parents stood behind him.
Yes.
They were not offended by the book. So where did Roth get all this? How did he know all this if it wasn't going on in his own family?
Do you think they should have been offended by the book?
No, well, uh, no, they shouldn't have, but I can see how they would.
Right.
Just,
Why?
just, just as all the rabbis were,
Right.
just as all the people who condemned him, Irving Howe and all the rest of them, that big meeting they had. Where was it? At Columbia, where
Right.
they went after him.
Well, in terms of I would be more offended if I were either one of the parents. I'd be more offended at the father. All this talk about his constipation, if I were, I would be offended by that, and the laxative and all that. Not very pleasant. And similarly, there's sort of an ambivalent attitude about the father's profession, his job. So he's working hard, but he's not sort of realizing the American dream like a lot of other people work as hard as he do. I've always thought that Roth's portrayal of his father is a little bit of a loser. And it's so hard. Reading a novel is a very personal thing. We all project onto the novel our own dynamics. So someone else might read the same thing and not see that. I Patrimony, which already was treated in an earlier book club, and a lot of people say it's a warm, loving portrait of Roth's father. When I read that book, I thought it was sort of a denunciation of his father in some ways, because
No,
talking very, I know it's just my personal reading, and I'm
yeah,
clearly a
okay.
minority on that. Most people did not feel the way I did, but in fact, I haven't really read anyone else who has felt my way. But I thought he's talking about having and cleaning up his father's shit, and I thought, if I were, incontinent, and my son was accompanying me in my last days, I'm not sure I'd want the general public to know about my bowel movements. So, but that's just a personal thing. But so it's very ambiguous. But in terms of the mother, I mean, aside from the fact this mania about cleaning and sweeping and dusting and cooking, which is not such a negative thing, I think she comes off pretty well. Now, in terms of the happy childhood, as you put it, I think I'm not convinced anyone who ends up being a writer really had a totally happy childhood. I think it's such a difficult thing to be a writer or artist in any way that I think that's coming from some sort of unhappiness. I find it hard to believe it's not. Now, that's not necessarily the parents' fault. It could just be that it's a very, very sensitive kid, and then life itself is very difficult, and so the kid is picking up on that. But I think the question of whether it was a happy or an unhappy childhood those terms are almost too general. It probably was happy in some ways and unhappy in other ways, to sort of paraphrase Tolstoy.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, and again, I'm reading the questions in the order that they come in. And this one is from Sheila. Let's see, where are you, Sheila? Don't see you right now. The speaker forgot to say that in Israel, Portnoy is impotent. What is your take on that?
Yeah, very good point. My take on it is that it gets to the whole question of the diaspora Jew versus the Israeli Jew. I mean, I have a very minority opinion on this, but I think Roth is very ambivalent about Zionism. I think one could argue that Roth is almost an anti-Zionist writer, and I'm saying that without judgment one way or the other. I'm just saying that that's my take on who. When you read Operation Shalak, for example, he puts in the mouth of the other Philip Roth, his double, this whole diasporism theory where the Ashkenazi Jews should move back to Europe. Freud would say that any sort of dream or fantasy reflects a desire. And you could also argue that the impotence of the Portnoy character is on some level, even it's unconscious, it's a choice, meaning he doesn't want to make love with this woman. He doesn't want to share his seed, so to speak, with her. He's as much as it's humiliating for him, it can be viewed as insulting for the woman. So they have two different views of Judaism. I think that the Rothian character sees the way both of these Jewish Israeli women are portrayed as sort of too matter of fact and not very spiritual and not sort of and just sort of lacking humor and sort of overly earnest and simplistic and not very interesting and not very feminine either. So did I answer the question there? But yes, I agree. The impotence is very important.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to mention about that end section in Israel, which I think is really critical because, Israel's supposed to be, the promised land and everybody's supposed to be happy and feel great when they go there. And instead, A, he's impotent, and B, he tries to rape the kibbutznik. Remember?
Sure.
But he decides not to, and they don't have sex either. So I mean, this ending is it's like the undoing of everything else. His satyriasis, if you want to call it that. His constant hard-on deserts him, and his tender sexual feelings turn into a rape wish.
Right. I'm not. Yeah, definitely.
Attempted rape.
Yes, but at the end, I think was at the end, and I'm not suggesting it's not a rape. It definitely was an attempted rape. But at the end, wasn't she almost willing to go along with him?
I don't remember. I mean, I have the book here, but
Right.
I could check it out. I think she kind of shoves him off because she's a big, strong girl too.
Right. But to get to your point, because it's very interesting, that reminds me of something I'd wanted to say in my earlier presentation, which is I'm not sure this book can even be teachable on an American campus today. I was at a Roth colloquium in March. Ira was there as well. And it was interesting to listen to professors, because I'm not a professor, talk about which books they can now teach on the campus. And I was getting the sense that Portnoy was not one of them. But with regard to your remark about tender sexual feelings, I don't think that's really, generally speaking, the way the sex works for the Rothian character. I think partly that's why he's attracted to these non-Jewish women. There's a difference. There's almost I don't want to say hostility, that's too strong, but the conflict or the confrontation or the difference between him and the woman is very exciting. After Goodbye Columbus, where in the short story, which is half of the book, the heroine is Brenda Patamkin, and she's a Jewish woman. That's really the end of the Jewish heroine in Roth's work, aside from this Israeli interlude. After that, all the heroines are non-Jewish women. The Rothian character, whether he's called Philip or whether he's called Nathan Zuckerman or whether he's called Kepish, he wants to sleep with non-Jewish women. That's what gets him excited. That's what he's doing. And there's something, that's something that I think has been underanalyzed. But why is he only going out with non-Jewish women and almost never with Jewish women? You throw out the first book, and that's the way it is. Now, you could say that Claire was based on Claire Bloom, and Claire Bloom was, who was the English actress, was Jewish. But first of all, Roth sort of criticized her for being a self-hating Jew, and she had very little Jewish culture and didn't come off as very Jewish, number one. And number two, she was called Claire in the fictional work, so it wasn't even officially Claire Bloom. On the other hand, in Deception, he's very much excited by this English aristocrat, which is sort of another oppositional figure to the Jewish hero. So I think it's not like sort of about being friends and then sort of, okay, now let's make love because we're just such good buddies. No, he's really, the Rothian character is really interested in some oppositional thing. I don't know if I answered your question. If not, feel free to modify it.
Well, I mean, it's a discussion thing. I just wanted to say that Monkey is the only person with whom he does experience real tenderness. There is that interlude when they go to the country,
right,
up to Vermont, and they both seem to experience real tenderness for the first time, because she's not a character who has experienced much in the way of tenderness either.
True.
Anyway.
I know that's true. And again, another recurring theme in Roth's work is the Jewish hero who's going to rescue the Goyish woman who's been mistreated in the past. So she's been raped, or she's been abused, or she's just had violent, evil husbands. And the Jewish hero now he's her savior. And that's a word actually in Portnoy's complaint. She's found her savior. And but I agree with you. It's a very tender scene where he quotes Yeats. But that said, the tenderness comes together when one of the two of them reads the Yeats poem, which is a poem which shows up 3 times in Roth's work, Leda and the Swan, and that's about a rape. So they're sort of a tender communion over a reading of a poem, which is a poem about rape.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sheila. Okay, the next question is from Arlene. Go ahead, Arlene, and tell us where you're from.
Well, I actually was born in Newark, but right now I'm in Seabright, New Jersey. And my question was, despite all the Jewish references, Roth wanted to be known as an American writer versus an American Jewish writer. Do you think he succeeded?
Did he succeed for you?
Yes and no. And I think I've read about 15 of the 30 books, and I've taught several of them in a peer learning program that I'm in, but I'm not totally sure. Sometimes I think yes, but I've read enough about him to know that that's what he wanted. He thought of those American Southern writers as his forebears as writers, but I'm not sure he did. I'd like to know what you think.
Thank you. Interesting what you said. I hadn't thought of the Southern thing. Wasn't totally aware of that. I would say the Southern writers, though they may be American, but they're Southern writers. For me, he did not succeed. For me, he's still a Jewish American writer, but I prefer in France, his breakthrough came with the American Pastoral and then the trilogy that followed that. And those are not my favorite books by Roth. My favorite books are really Goodbye Columbus, Portnoy, and then the Newark trilogy from the 70s and 80s, and then maybe add Professor of Desire, Deception, 1 or 2 others. So, and I am tempted to say of him what he said of Bellow, namely that it's the books where the Jewishness is most explicit that are, well, that's not exactly what he said about Bellow, but I actually prefer the explicitly Jewish books by Bellow, and I'd feel the same way about Roth. But also I think he changed. I don't think one thing that hasn't been analyzed that much is he said in the 2010s that he went back and started to reread all his books going backwards. And then he got to, I forget if it was My Life as a Man or Portnoy, and he stopped and he wasn't interested anymore. So he sort of has disowned his earlier books. And he also had called Goodbye Columbus sort of an exercise in learning how to write, or his, dues he'd paid to learning how to write. Similarly, in the Zerkman trilogy, Goodbye Columbus is referred to as higher education. So he has sort of a contempt for his earlier work, which I do not share. And similarly, in Exit Ghost, it's a rewriting of the ghostwriter, in which a lot of the ambiguity which made the ghostwriter interesting is sort of thrown out the window. So there's sort of you could almost say a self-hating Jew, or rather a self-hating Jewish writer. He's sort of disowning the books that I like the most. So I guess the answer to the question is that if you like the Roth from the late 1990s, 2000s, then yes, I'd say he is an American writer. If you like the earlier Roth, then he's an American Jewish writer.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Kate. Kate, I haven't seen you in a while, and Kate usually asks this question to all of our presenters. Go ahead, Kate.
Hello, how are you? And thank you so much for your presentation. My question is always the same, and I ask all the scholars, why no Nobel Prize for Philip Roth? Thank you.
Right, sure, thank you. First of all, no American writer born in America, no male American writer born in America who doesn't play the guitar has won the Nobel Prize since 1962. John Steinbeck was the last one. Since then, all the Americans who've won the prize were born in other countries, and therefore you maybe didn't feel so American. And then I guess Toni Morrison won the prize, right? She won the Nobel Prize, correct? I have
Yeah,
a memory.
Did and Bob Dylan that you were
Yeah, but
referring.
Bob Dylan plays the guitar. He's a musician, so I think that's different. So as I said, no one who doesn't play the guitar. And I think the Nobel Committee, the head of the committee 5 or 10 years ago made a very explicit anti-American remark and saying that he thought American writers were very parochial and sort of turned into themselves and weren't that open to other cultures, other people, other worlds. So I think there's an anti-Americanism on the part of the Nobel Committee. That's part of it. And the second part of it is that he's sort of considered a sort of a dirty writer, or maybe sort of he was considered sort of a egotistical, a nombraliste, they would say in French, someone who's looking at his own navel. If you look at Hemingway, for example, the Hemingway got the award in '54 right after he came out with the short story, The Old Man and the Sea, which was sort of a more humanistic story. He didn't get it for The Sun Also Rises or A Farewell to Arms or some of these books which are about love affairs or sex. He got it for a book which is really sort of ascetic in a way, and it's just about one man pitted against nature, a fisherman, a poor man at that. So I think the Nobel Committee has also their own. There's the anti-Americanism on the one hand, and then there's this idea that they're not going to sort of give it to a trashy or controversial writer. They want to give it to a writer who has sort of noble, pardon the pun, ambitions.
Thank you.
You came very, very close to my sentiment that he is not just, they did not consider him a good human, and that's why.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, a comment from Mary, and we might need to raise our hands for this, but Mary, go ahead and ask your question and tell us where you're joining us from.
Hi, I'm joining from Chicago. Another friend of mine is on this too. We've have a Philip Roth book club. We've read about 17 of the books, but not Portnoy yet. Cool. I just wondered how many people who are here today, if anyone, actually read the book when it was published and such a sensation. I'll be coming to it in my 70s. Even though I've worked in publishing all my life, I avoided Philip Roth until the plague, when we started with Nemesis. So that's where I'm coming from. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see a few of us have raised our hands. Okay, I see about 5 hands. Let's see. And we have a question from an anonymous attendee. What did you think of the movie version?
Portnoy's Complaint? Was there a movie of Portnoy's Complaint? I'm not aware of there was a movie of Portnoy's Complaint. I think that would be hard.
I watched it last night.
I didn't know that. I'll have to watch it.
Richard Benjamin and Karen Black are the principal
I didn't
people.
even know that. I love the Goodbye Columbus movie with Richard Benjamin. I love that. I didn't know there was a Portnoy's Complaint. That's amazing.
It was quite a, I think it was obviously R-rated, if not X-rated, I'm sure, by the Catholic Church, but it was it seems pretty faithful to the book. I haven't read all of the book yet, but from what from the incidents you're talking about, it seems like it's quite a bit of dialogue lifted directly from the book, and the characters seem true, and I think it did quite well, but it was controversial, like the book was. But yeah, with such an enormous bestseller, of course somebody's going to try to make a movie.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Although a lot of the Roth books have been optioned, but never produced, or produced badly, and none of them have done all that well. I would say this one by far probably was had the largest audience for the cinema, for obvious reasons.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'm dying to watch it. I had no idea. I'm going to definitely watch it. I think Richard Benjamin is a great actor, underrated. And I think he was wonderful in Goodbye Columbus. To answer the previous questions for myself, though I didn't read it, Portnoy's Complaint, when it came out in '69, I think I saw it on the bookshelf somewhere, maybe at my parents' home. And it was one of those books where I sort of had a vague notions of what it was about. Particularly, there's about masturbation, and that someone just sent a note that it was 13% on Rotten Tomatoes, I guess. So it may have been a commercial success, but not a critical success. Portnoy's Complaint. But anyway, the book was one of those things that I was sort of, for me as a 12-year-old, I was born in 57. It was sort of an adult, forbidden, exciting, mysterious thing.
And then there's a follow-up from the anonymous attendee. The film version was a critical failure compared to Goodbye Columbus. And, oh, this is interesting. And Philip Roth died on actor Richard Benjamin's 80th birthday.
Interesting.
Okay. So please help me out here, attendee. Some of you raised your hand for Mary's last question. If you can put them down or in the chat, let me know if you have a question, because I can't tell. I'm wondering, maybe Ira has something to contribute, so I'll invite Ira to speak. Ira, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, there's a great deal of topics here, Steve. You've done a wonderful job in presenting a panoply of both Roth's career and the book. But what I'm interested in is Roth today in France, and particularly Portnoy. You alluded to issues teaching Roth in university climate, but what about the general readership? Do you have any sense that people are reading Philip Roth, that they're interested in Roth, and not so much the life, not so much his behavior, or some would say misbehavior, but as a writer? What's your sense of that?
Well, first of all, I always preface this Roth's own remark, which I thought was brilliant. He said that writing in 20 years, novel reading in 20 years, and he said maybe much before, will become like the population of people reading novels will be like the population of people reading Latin lyric poetry, that reading is declining, that reading novels was already being defeated by movie screens, and then there was the television screen, and then there was the computer screen, and against all these screens, reading doesn't have much of a chance. And I agree with that. I think that's a very courageous impression. That said, I think to the extent that reading as a whole is losing its market share, if you'll pardon the expression, Roth has still got a good piece of that market share. I think that American authors are the French public is very interested in American authors, and when you open the book section of Le Monde or the Figaro, maybe half of the pages of new books coming out are new American books coming out in French translation. But what hurts Roth now is that he's dead. That hurts him a little bit, because when he had new books coming out, that kept him in the conversation. On the other hand, there was a film adaptation of Deception recently by a well-known French filmmaker, Arnaud Desplechin, and that certainly sparked interest in his reading. If this is a non-statistical example, when I go to my local bookstore, you find all of his novels, and they take up a large part of the space there. And then the other thing is, I think the city of New York has an enormous fascination for French people, and undoubtedly for many other cultures. And Roth, I think, right or wrong, is perceived as a New York writer. I mean, we would say he's from Newark, but I think for most people he's considered a New York writer. When you see pictures of Roth in French literary magazines, often you'll see a picture of New York behind him, or for example, that picture from his apartment on, I think it was 77th Street. So since New York is such a strong selling point, Roth is, when I first came to Paris, when I moved here in 94, everyone in the subway was reading Paul Auster, and I'd never heard of Paul Auster, and everyone was reading the New York trilogy. And I thought, who is this guy, Paul Auster? Well, after American Pastoral came out, Roth sort of replaced Paul Auster as the New York Jewish go-to guy. So I think there's still a lot of interest for Roth.
Well, that's pretty fascinating. I love this idea of the New York writer. I think we forget about that, but you've identified something very important. Most of the photographs of Roth have tended to be set in New York. I'm interested in the pictures of Roth on his book jackets, which tend to evolve. And they tend to move from the back of the jacket to the front of the jacket in terms of the Library of America series. And if you bought all 10 volumes and placed them on a table, you would see Roth mature from a very young man to somebody in their 70s, and then eventually the 80s. And he had a tremendous, pardon the pun, hand in selecting those covers. He is the one who chose the pictures and kind of set that as the motif. And you could do a wonderful piece on pictures of Roth, not pictures at an exhibition, not pictures of Feidelman, I think it's a Malamud book, but pictures of Roth. It would be quite revealing, I think.
Interesting.
So I like this idea of urban Roth. It somehow ties in with Roth's desire to be an American writer and what could be more American than being in New York City. I cannot imagine, and I've thought about this, Philip Roth in Los Angeles. He would be so out of place and so much not a West Coast writer, so that he reinforces this notion of at least this American Jewish writer at this particular time in a urban metropolitan setting. Yes, Chicago a tiny bit, but it's really New York. It's as if Bellow claimed Chicago. That's my city, and Roth has claimed New York.
Very interesting. What you're saying makes me think of that scene in, or did it happen in Annie Hall? Oh, I think or certainly he didn't go to LA to get his Oscar award, Woody Allen, but I think also there's a scene briefly where the character in Annie Hall by Woody Allen goes to LA and he can't get out of there fast enough. What you're saying about Roth makes me think of him.
Yeah. Fascinating. Geographic Roth, it's a whole new area to explore. And you have to include maps, right? And this sort of thing. Remember, he had a map of the apartment that he grew up in Newark, in his New York apartment. He kept it up on the wall, which is very interesting to remind him. Maybe it's nostalgia. We haven't talked about nostalgia in Roth. I don't think sentimentality is the right word, but I think there's a certain nostalgia for a world that disappeared. And that's partly why he never leaves Newark, broadly speaking, or parts of New Jersey, but neither does he really renounce his childhood. He's still trying to come to grips with it. And that's why your earlier comments on Freud, I think, are very significant and, again, can be elaborated, especially in the later books.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. And that portrait that Ira was just talking about was taken by Nancy Crampton. And just a fun fact is that Roth had borrowed the map from our local history room here at the Newark Public Library, and then it never came back to us.
Oh, that's good.
Arlene has a follow-up comment. Go ahead, Arlene.
I won't use any names, but I was at a synagogue dinner telling someone about a course that I was teaching about Philip Roth, and I could see that the cantor, a young man, maybe in his 40s, was really listening to me, even though I wasn't talking to him. Later on, when we got up to go to the dessert buffet, he came up to me and told me that he read Portnoy's complaint when he was 13 and that he reread it every year on his birthday. I, of course, did not know what to say to that, but I never forgot it, obviously.
Funny.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. So this one is from Guy. Let me find you on the list here. Give me 1 second. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
I was interested in what you think it means at the end of the book where the psychiatrist says with his accent, "Now we must begin," or something like that. Right. Do you think there's really more story to be told about Portnoy's experiences before that? I mean, he blurbs out quite a bit, you know.
Sure.
And I thought maybe the only one answer might be that the rest of the story is all the rest of the books that he writes, but of course those pertain to his life later. I mean, how do you take the psychiatrist's comments just as a sort of tricky way to end the book, or as something more than that?
Well, it could be just that, but I think there's a few ways to read it. And I like the question, and I like the ending a lot of the book. I think, for one thing, he's the first time that the doctor speaks, I believe. And so we see it's a sort of a German accent, a Viennese accent. It makes you think of Freud. So, and again, it's not the Yiddish, but it's similar. So it's telling us something about there. You could almost getting to Ira's point about nostalgia. There's maybe some sort of nostalgia for this Viennese intellectual world of before. Roth's family originally is from Galicia, which was part of the Austrian Empire. The other thing is that's sort of maybe a fond nod towards psychoanalysis, because there's always something more to say. A lot of times, I've been in psychoanalysis for a long time. I know other people have been as well. And some people will go back for a second tranche, as they say, a second, and they find, my God, I've been in psychoanalysis for 10 years and I didn't get to that. That's so basic. And now I'm just talking about that for the first time right now. So there's something very realistic about that sense at the same time. Okay, now the blah, blah is finished. Now we're going to get to the real material. So it's really giving the reader a sort of an affectionate, bittersweet, sarcastic, at the same time affectionate taste of psychoanalysis.
Good answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. One very last quick question from Miss Nancy. Did Roth regret writing this book?
That would be more a question for Ira or a biographer. Personally, I don't think so, but if there's actually any concrete evidence about that, I would not be aware of it. I would answer as a reader of Roth's fiction. Does the writer of Karnofsky, does the Zuckerman character in the Newark trilogy, who earlier wrote this book, Karnofsky, does he regret having published Karnofsky? Based on that evidence, I would say no.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Our next book club meeting will take place in December. So Saturday, December 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern. Our host, James DeBan, will be discussing the afterword to Portnoy's complaint. It's a piece called Juice or Gravy, which was included in the 25th anniversary edition of Portnoy's complaint. All members of the book club will receive the PDF of Juice and Gravy, or Juice or Gravy. And also note that our Roth annual lecture featuring John Wesley Johnson will take place at the Newark Public Library on Thursday, November 2nd at 6 p.m. The title of Dr. Johnson's talk is History, Memory, and the Archaic Section of Newark. It will be recorded and made available on the Newark Public Library's YouTube channel in due time, but please do check our website and register for that. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much to Stephen Sampson for leading this wonderful discussion. It is being recorded, and I will add it to the Philip Roth Personal Library YouTube page in a short while. And I hope to reconnect with all of you again in December.
Thank you, Nadine. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.